Hey guys, so we got ourselves another user suggested video, this time coming from Will, who is on the Discord server, and today we'll be doing the top 10 plurality votes in Survivor history. And I think this is a pretty interesting topic considering that on Survivor, most votes are not simply a plurality, but rather a majority. And in cases where it's not a majority, it tends to be an idle play, or there's some other shenanigans going on that kind of muck up the vote count. But in this video, we'll be looking at some of the best plurality votes in Survivor history. Now, before I get started, I do want to lay out my criteria for what counts as a plurality vote, and for that I do have some criteria. So first up, I do not count any tied votes. As while a tie is technically a plurality, they tend to not stay that way on the revote, where it's usually a majority breaking the tie. And regardless, ties are fundamentally different from plurality votes to where I could make a separate video just on those. And my other main criteria is I will not be including any successful idle plays, or for that matter, any successful use of a advantage that negates votes, such as a shot in the dark or a legacy advantage. As while these votes technically become pluralities, as it's usually a group smaller than the majority taking someone out of the game, that minority usually becomes a majority of the votes counted after the idle negates all the votes. And sort of similar to ties, I feel like idle plays are fundamentally different from plurality votes to where I could make a whole separate video just on those. But with that said, I will be including votes where an idol is played unsuccessfully, as I feel like those can open it up for someone to be taken out with a plurality of the counted votes. And with that in mind, I do have a couple of honorable mentions to get into before we get into the actual list. So first up, I did consider the Brendan tribal from Survivor Tocantins, which happened at the Final 9, where Brendan was taken out in a 4-3-2 vote. And this vote is technically significant as it does mark the collapse of the Exile Alliance that seemed to play a big factor in the pre-merge. However, the main reason I did not put it on was that it was a split vote where at that point JT, Steven, and Taj were working with Coach and Tyson's alliance despite them coming into the merge down in numbers, and they split their vote knowing that Brennan and Sierra had been to exile and that there were rumors out there that they had the idol through that. And through that, it effectively became a 7-2 vote with Brennan and Sierra on the outs, which to me is not as interesting as a plurality vote, so because of that, I didn't quite consider it. Next up, I did consider the cast vote at the final 13 of Survivor Cambodia, which ended up being a really insane vote count, where Cass is taken out in a 6-4-2-1 vote, but very similar to the Brennan blindside, this was also split vote where it was 6 votes on Cass and 4 votes on Sierra, making it an effective 10-3 majority, asserting their will on the minority. And while there's another vote from this season that will be on the actual list, I did not decide to put the Cass vote on here simply for that reason. Next up, I did consider the Morgan blindside from Survivor Ghost Island, where Morgan was taken out in a 4-3-1 vote. And the main reason I considered it is it was the one point during the season where Wendell and Dominic, who ended up dominating the season moving forward, were genuinely out of the loop and they genuinely suffered a loss here. And I feel like that alone makes this kind of interesting. But again, in the grand scheme of the season, it's not that significant as, like I said, Dominic and Wendell end up dominating the game moving forward. So I feel like for that reason, I didn't quite put it on. Next up, I did consider the Joe blindside at the final 13 of Edge of Extinction, which very similar to the Cass blindside is another really chaotic vote where Joe is taken out in a 6-3-2-2 vote. Again, crazy vote count there. However, I feel like this kind of suffers from being on a season like Edge of Extinction, which ends up having a really dynamic post-merge, where we literally see at the very next tribal, we see someone from this plurality, that being Eric, blindsided himself. And I feel like when you have a post-merge like that, it makes the individual votes less impactful, as you know that the very next vote, everything could change. So I feel like with its impact being hampered by that, I feel like I couldn't quite put it on because of it. And the final honorable mention we'll be getting into is the Omer blindside at the final 6 of Survivor 42. And I mainly considered it because it was a pretty creative use of an extra vote where Marianne ended up using her extra vote to take out Omer in a 3-2-2 vote where the vote was split on Romeo in case Lindsay used her amulet. And obviously this ended up becoming a pretty defining vote by the end of it, where it becomes a pretty big move for Marianne's resume when she makes her case at Final Tribal. However, I feel like compared to the plurality votes we'll get into in the actual top 10, I feel like other ones are either more entertaining or more impactful in how they impacted the game moving forward, so because of that, I didn't quite consider it. So those are all my honorable mentions along with my criteria. Both all out of the way, we have 10 votes to get into, and unless I waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, and I did debate this one along with some of the honorable mentions. However, I feel like this one is definitely one of the more entertaining ones. But at number 10, we do have the Boston Rob boot from Survivor Heroes versus Villains, where Rob is taken out in a 4-3-1 vote, with Coach casting the one stray vote onto Courtney. And I feel like from an entertainment perspective, this was a really interesting outcome for the season, where obviously up to that point, Boston Rob had been controlling the villain's tribe until Russell got a one-up on him at the previous vote where he tricked Tyson into voting himself out of the game. But even after that, Rob's group still had the majority on the villain's tribe, meaning that Russell had to flip at least one more person, and he was able to do so by flipping over Jerry and Coach. However, Coach was simply unwilling to vote for Boston Rob for whatever reason, but through that, it becomes an effective 5-3 majority. And admittedly, that is part of the reason why this one is a bit lower on the list, as the fact that it is a plurality vote at all is kind of trivial at the end of the day. But I still feel like this was a very entertaining aspect to all this. The fact that it was the culmination of the Rob and Russell rivalry on the season. And obviously, while we would get a sequel to that in Redemption Island, I feel like this was definitely a big boon to why the pre-merge of Heroes vs. Villains is so satisfying. To see Russell topple Rod's power structure and take him out is a big reason why this one is on the list to begin with. So I feel like those are all factors why I have it on the list. But again, it probably should not have been a plurality vote, but I feel like it was enough to have it here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this one's kind of the opposite of the Boston Rob vote, where while this vote doesn't have that big of an impact on the season moving forward, the fact that it is a plurality vote is pretty insane. But we actually have the Vince Sly vote from Worlds Apart, where of the votes on this list, this ends up happening the earliest in the game, where it's only the second tribal of the season. Or while Vince seems like someone you'd expect to be an early boot on any season, the fact that this ended up being a 3-2-1 vote is really insane. And the thing is, Vince was planning to orchestrate a 3-2-1 vote to save himself, where Will was supposed to vote with him and Nina to take out Jen, but obviously he backed out of the plan at the last moment, and through that, Vince ended up being the victim instead. But still, this is a tribal that had no reason to be a 3-2-1 vote, and I feel like for that alone, it deserves to be on this list. The reason it's not higher is it doesn't really impact the game moving forward, where obviously Nina's taken out next, and in general, with it being so early in the game, a lot happens to where it's not really that impactful. But still, I feel like the fact that it was so crazy to begin with, it deserves to be here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and I knew coming into this that these 8 were going to make the list, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 8, we actually have one of the more recent plurality votes, and here we have the Sydney Tribal from Survivor 41. Now, I'm actually a little surprised this one is as low as it is, as it's obviously a really chaotic vote, where it ends up becoming a 5-4-3 vote. And obviously, the events leading up to this vote are a roller coaster, where first up you have all the hourglass stuff, which, I could do without. But then we get to the actual tribal itself, where Liana asks Xander for his idol using the knowledge is power, only for Xander to say, no, but you can have this fake. And this reveal really causes the majority to scramble to throw together a split vote plan, as they now worry that an idol could be played on Evie, and that causes them to split their vote onto Sydney. And obviously that plan goes through, but even then we have a situation where Sydney decides to use her shot in the dark in a position where it causes her to be voted out, where had she not used her shot in the dark and gone to vote, she probably votes for Evie, that causes a 5-5 tie, and Sydney easily stays on the revote. But because Sydney sacrificed her vote for a shot in the dark, she ends up being taken out here in a plurality vote. So I find all that to be very interesting and obviously a pretty chaotic vote. So obviously that's a big reason why this made the list, as it's definitely one of the more interesting tribals in the new era. But with all that said, I feel like there are a couple of reasons why it's not higher. One is that it doesn't really change the game dynamics moving forward, where moving forward the Yases are still at the bottom and we see Tiffany being the next boot and then Evie's taken out afterwards. I feel like this vote doesn't really shake up the game too much, as Sydney was probably one of the more expendable people within the Luvu group. And I feel like even if she had not been taken out here, I feel like she probably is unlikely to win the game. So I feel like that's definitely a knock against this tribal. And I feel like the other thing is it is heavily reliant on twists, where obviously you have the fact that half the tribe is immune from this, which obviously limits the options there. You also have the knowledge is power that really influence the tribal itself. And then obviously the shot in the dark very much influenced the tribal itself. All these were brand new things that the players weren't used to. And I feel like with the amount that this tribal relies on twists to create a lot of the drama, I feel like that definitely holds it back to a degree for me. But that still doesn't take away from how solid this tribal was, and it's a big reason he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a pretty fun blindside here, definitely one of my favorite tribals, and that is the Scott Pollard blindside at the final 8 of Survivor Co. Wrong. And again, this is a pretty fun blindside here, where obviously Ty had been working with Jason and Scott for a lot of the game until Aubrey gets him to flip at this round, and this turns what would have been a 3-3-2 tie into a 4-2-2 plurality where Scott is taken out here. So obviously that alone makes this pretty good. But I think what really elevates this is the fact that Scott and Ty had made this deal to combine their idols to make a god idol that would have allowed Scott to save himself at this tribal. And we get this really great moment after the votes are read where Scott turns to Ty and he's expecting Ty to pull out his idol to form the super idol, only for Ty to tell him no, and you can see how defeated Scott looks as he gets up to have his torch snuffed. Again, it's a fantastic tribal from an entertainment perspective, and that's a big reason why I have it on this list, not to mention the fact that Aubrey did manage to convince Ty to flip over, and just see Ty trying to rationalize his betrayal after the fact. Again, all that's great. But I feel like the top 6 tribals are probably more interesting from a gameplay perspective, which is a big reason why I have it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty classic tribal, and we're going all the way back to Survivor Borneo to the Gretchen vote. And obviously this one's pretty iconic, where Gretchen is taken out in a 4-to-1-to-1-to-1-to-1-to-1-to-1 vote. Again, something you never see on modern Survivor, but I feel like it also really highlights the importance of alliances this early on in Survivor history, where the 4 votes on Gretchen were cast by the 4 people within a solid alliance, whereas everyone not within an alliance decided to throw their votes in every single direction you can imagine. And obviously, while that's pretty insane on its own, it also makes the point starkly clear that you need to have numbers in the game. And while this vote didn't give the Tage Alliance the outright majority, we do see after this vote that the Pagongs do make some efforts to get an alliance going. However, a lot of them are pretty unsuccessful. But I feel like this vote alone just really hammers home the point that alliances are necessary. And at the same time, it's just fun seeing like the votes being all over the place and Gretchen saying that it's me when she sees all the votes coming in for her. And again, it's a pretty classic tribal, so it's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have the tribal that I was mentioning in the honorable mentions, and that is the Stephen Fishback blindside from Survivor Cambodia. And again, this is another really fun vote coming immediately after Steven had been saved by an idol, which is all pretty good. And it's also the first round of the entire game where Joe Anglim is not immune, which is pretty funny. And we see Steven pushing really hard to blindside Joe right at the bat here, even going so far as to use his vote steal to steal Joe's vote, which is all pretty funny. Though at the same time, we see the majority line splitting their votes between Joe and Abby under the guise that Joe has an idol, and this opens the door for the outsiders in Wentworth, Keith, and Abby Maria to orchestrate a blindside on Steven, and they are successfully able to flip Spencer to their side, and Steven badly misuses the vote steal here, where he does end up splitting the 2 votes between Abby Maria and Joe. That opens it up further for him to be taken out in a 4-3-2 vote. Again, kind of funny how he ends up misusing this advantage in a way that causes him to be voted out. And obviously with the minority taking advantage of a vote split to get the numbers here is all really fascinating to me. Again, it's just a pretty fun blindside here. And yes, while it is kind of reliant on an advantage, I kind of like how it's reliant on a misuse of an advantage more so than anything else, but also the minority taking advantage of a vote split to take out someone within the majority. And yes, while the majority reasserts itself the following round by taking out Joe, I feel like the fact that they were able to get a 1-up on the majority for this run round through a plurality vote was enough to have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this may be recency bias. However, I feel like this is still a really chaotic tribal, and that is the most recent plurality vote in Survivor up to this point, and that is the Julie tribal from Survivor 45. And again, this ended up being a really chaotic vote for the final 5, which is normally a pretty stable round of the game, especially in the new era, where at this point we are getting a 2-to-1-to-1 vote, And yes, one of the votes are negated by Katura, but I feel like there were so many things going on at this tribal that resulted in the vote count being as crazy as it was. Where for one, you had the fact that Jake plays his idol on Katura versus himself, where he had gone into this tribal wanting it to be a blindside, where he wanted to go in, play the idol, have Katura being completely shocked, and for everyone to just be amazed by this big move, and all for it to blow up in his face, where by him doing that, it actually sketched out Katura to the point where she flipped her vote to Julie, which obviously caused his entire plan to backfire. So there's that. You also have Dee being unwilling to write down Julie's name, where despite her knowing that Julie was a big threat, she just couldn't bring herself to do so. And the fact that this almost costs her the game is really funny on its own. You have the fact that Katura decides to flip her vote to begin with, where she literally flips her vote at the last moment due to her being unsure over what's going to happen. Even Austin, like, while he ends up playing this round the best out of everyone, you had the fact that he was unsure about voting for Julie for much of the day, and it really wasn't until moments before Tribal that he decides that he had to make this move to write down Julie's name. And then you have Julie, again, she kind of plays this round the worst, where she ends up voting for Jake, which ends up being a really backwards move, and obviously one that kind of further contributed to her being taken out here. So it's really interesting breaking down this vote, where each individual person was thinking something different coming to this vote, and most of the people here played this round completely wrong. Where Jake had this misconception about him thinking that surprising people with the idol play would somehow work in his favor. You have Dee not wanting to do what's in her best interest. You have Katura flipping her vote at the last moment. You have Julie throwing her vote on the Jake, which is pretty dumb. And the fact that almost none of this is motivated by some new era twist or any sort of format change, and the fact that it's pretty much entirely dictated by what the players are thinking outside the idol, I feel like that alone makes this really riveting for me, and a big reason it's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have another pretty classic tribal here, and that is the Courtney tribal from Survivor Panama, the 3-2-1. And again, this is another pretty classic tribal, definitely Cirie's best work from this season. We're obviously coming to the final 6. You had the fact that Aris was the main target of Terry and Courtney after Terry had won his 4th immunity. You have Shane wanting to protect Courtney, who he saw as his easiest beat at the end. And you also have Terry, who also saw Courtney as his easiest beat. And through that guaranteed Courtney a spot in the final 2, and it's definitely something that worried Cirie. As obviously by having Courtney in the final 2, that's one less spot for someone like her to get to the end. And this really empowered Cirie to weaponize this idea of taking out a GOAT by pulling in her close allies Aris and Danielle in order to blindside Courtney in a 3-2-1. And it was very effective, where obviously Courtney's taken out, and it's just fun seeing all the blindsided reactions from Terry and Shane as Courtney's being taken out. Again, it's a pretty iconic vote, definitely one of the classic examples of not having to rely on the majority to get your way, and who else to show this concept than one of the greatest players of all time. So I feel like that alone makes this very high on the list for me, but I feel like the top 2 were probably more impactful for me, which is a big reason I have it here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have another classic on our hands in my eyes, and that is the second Matt blindside from Redemption Island. Again, this is the one that happens at the final 12, after Matt had gone back from Redemption Island the first time, only to be sent back to Redemption Island immediately afterwards. I feel like that alone is very much poetic and speaks to Matt's game, but I feel like the way that it happened is also really fascinating, where we see Matt coming back in, and you think that he would immediately flip over to the other side, the Zapateras, and considering that the Zapateras were down in numbers, they needed Matt's vote in order to ensure that they would have at least a tie coming to the merge to potentially get the numbers there. And considering that Matt had already been blindsided by the Ometepes, you think Matt would be able to flip over. Except he ends up going back on his morals, and that causes him to go back to the very same group that voted him out the first time. We even see him sitting down with Boss and Rob and admitting that he had considered flipping only to turn back. But then we see Rob see this as a show of arrogance, and that causes him to send Matt back to Redemption Island. And obviously on its face, you'd think this be a risky play, considering that he'd be going from a 7-5 majority to a 6-5 majority. However, he's still able to execute this plurality vote, where Matt thinks the plan is to vote out Steve, which then causes it to be a 6-5-1 vote, sending Matt back to Redemption Island. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you also have Ralph wasting his idol on Mike, thinking that Mike was the Ometepe's target, really blindsiding the Zapateras here alongside Matt by taking out Matt and at the same time, like wasting the idol in such a way to where it'd be impossible for the Zappateros to blindside Rob in the future. Again, I feel like this is a masterful round by Boss and Rob, where he not only solidifies his majority Ometepe group coming into the merge, he also weakens the Zappateros in a way that allows them to be picked off one by one moving forward. You have the entire storyline of Matt fighting his way to get back into the game from Redemption Island, only to be sent right back there. And then you have Rob really establishing his stranglehold on the game. Again, I feel like there's so many things going from this tribal from a gameplay perspective, but also from an entertainment perspective, that I have it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best plurality vote in Survivor history to me is the Sophie blindside from Winners at War. And for me, this was the pretty definitive number 1. I feel like this is probably the best blindside from a games perspective, but also from a entertainment perspective, where obviously this comes from the This Is Extortion episode, which is already a great episode for Tony, where obviously he has his whole like navigating of the extortion disadvantage, having to get fire tokens, winning the immunity challenge, and just having a lot of really fun confessionals. But I feel like this blindside here really is the icing on the cake here, as I feel like this is a move that really had a high level of difficulty. We're coming to the round, Sophie was one of the best positioned players in the entire game, being the glue that held together the majority alliance, and while Tony himself was very well positioned, he also knew that Sophie was closer to Sarah at this point compared to him, so he needed to get Sophie out to ensure that Sarah would be completely on his side for the rest of the game. And he also saw that this vote was going to be a vote split, where the vote was being split between Jeremy and Michelle at that point. So obviously through that, he would need to pull in some of the outsiders to ensure this vote would go through. And he is successfully able to pull in Michelle and Nick without too much issue. But then we see him having to pull in Jeremy, and obviously the sun was going down and the time is running out, but he's able to pull in Jeremy at the last moment. And through that, he's able to blindside Sophie in a 4-3-2 vote, and Sophie having an idol in her pocket as well. Again, this was a really high level difficulty move, and this was the perfect time to do so, as if he had waited too long, Sophie would have been able to have too many numbers over him and still having her idol to work with. But by taking her out now, Tony essentially puts himself in the center of the game, and while Sarah's mad at him at first, she does come back to his side, and Tony's allowed to really steamroll the game moving forward. Again, the fact that this move was very difficult to pull off, the fact that he was able to execute it in the way that he did, and the fact that this move was super impactful for his game moving forward, that allows him to play a dominant game moving forward, all that's really great. And it's Tony. Tony's a great character, and he is a very fun character. So I feel like all these things come together to make this the best plurality vote for me, which is why it's here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. And I'll be back again next week with another Survivor video, so you can look forward to that. I'm covering other shows such as Hell's Kitchen, The Traitors, and soon The Australian Survivor, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.